The early morning sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Regina Washington stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully pinning back her curly hair. She'd been the mayor for 2 years now, but some mornings she still couldn't believe she'd made history as the city's first black female mayor. Today was supposed to be special. She had planned to surprise the volunteers at the Oak Street Community Garden, where local residents were transforming an abandoned lot into something beautiful. "Keep it casual," she muttered to herself, picking out a comfortable pair of jeans and her favorite navy blue sweater. She deliberately chose to dress down, wanting to get her hands dirty alongside the volunteers. That was her style, no fancy suits or motorcades when she visited local projects. She believed real leadership meant standing shoulder to shoulder with her community. Regina grabbed a quick breakfast, just a banana and her morning coffee in her well-worn travel mug. Her husband Robert, still half asleep, reminded her not to skip lunch like she often did when she got caught up in community work. "I packed you a sandwich," he called out from the kitchen, making her smile. Even after 20 years of marriage, he still looked out for her like they were newlyweds. The morning air was crisp as she stepped out onto her porch, breathing in the familiar scent of blooming spring flowers from her neighbor's garden. Mrs. Chen, who had lived next door for 30 years, was already out watering her prized roses. They exchanged warm waves. This simple morning ritual meant more to Regina than any official ceremony. She climbed into her Honda Civic, the same car she'd driven since before becoming mayor. Her staff had suggested upgrading to something more mayoral, but she'd refused. This car had history. It had carried her through 3 campaigns, countless community meetings, and even brought her first grandchild home from the hospital. The warm leather seats and the small coffee stain on the passenger side told stories of real life, not political performance. As she drove through the quieter streets of her beloved city, Regina noticed the small changes that made her proud: new businesses opening up, fresh coats of paint on old buildings, and children walking to school along recently repaired sidewalks. These were the little victories that made all the late-night council meetings worth it. She took her usual shortcut through Cedar Street, mentally rehearsing her plans for the garden visit. Regina wanted to thank every volunteer personally, learn their stories, and understand their vision for the space. That's what had won her the election, not fancy speeches or big promises, but her genuine love for listening to people's stories and dreams for their community. The radio hummed softly in the background, playing old soul classics that reminded her of Sunday afternoons in her grandmother's kitchen. She was so caught up in memories and plans that she almost missed her turn. Regina made a quick decision to take the corner, not noticing the patrol car parked near the intersection. Little did she know, this simple morning, filled with ordinary moments and hopeful plans, was about to become anything but routine. In the next few minutes, her role as a mayor, her identity as a black woman, and her deep understanding of her community would all collide in an unexpected way that would test everything she believed about progress in her city. The day was about to change not just her life, but the entire community's perspective on power, privilege, and the long road ahead in building true understanding between law enforcement and the people they serve. And it all started with a simple turn at a quiet intersection on what should have been just another Tuesday morning in the life of a mayor who preferred gardening gloves to formal gauntlets. Officer James Barrett adjusted his collar for the 3rd time that morning, still not quite used to the feeling of the uniform after 6 months on the force. The morning briefing had been routine: watch for speeders, keep an eye on the construction zones, and maintain visibility in areas where there'd been recent car break-ins. Simple stuff for a Tuesday morning. He sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee that had already gone cold. His dad, a retired officer himself, had always told him that real police work was 90% patience and 10% action. Right now, it felt more like 99% patience. He'd chosen this quiet intersection because it gave him a good view of the neighborhood, while staying partially hidden behind old Mrs. Wilson's impressive hedge of flowering bushes. The morning traffic moved steadily, parents dropping kids at school, delivery trucks making their rounds, and people heading to work. Barrett kept one eye on the traffic and another on his laptop, where he was finishing up reports from yesterday's shift. His training officer had drilled into him the importance of thorough documentation, even for the most routine stops. A flash of movement caught his attention. A Honda Civic made a sudden turn without properly signaling, cutting across lanes in a way that made Barrett sit up straighter. He'd seen countless similar turns at this intersection, but this one seemed particularly abrupt. His training kicked in automatically: observe, assess, decide. Dispatch, Unit 247, he spoke into his radio, already starting his engine. I'm initiating a traffic stop on a blue Honda Civic, license plate. He recited the numbers as the car moved ahead of him. Everything by the book, just like they taught him at the academy. His heart rate picked up slightly. Even routine stops could turn complicated, and his instructors had hammered that point home repeatedly. Barrett flipped on his lights, following procedure perfectly. The Civic continued for a moment, not unusual, as sometimes drivers needed time to find a safe place to pull over. He noticed the car was well maintained, not too old, with no obvious defects. The driver chose a wide spot on the street, pulling over smoothly and professionally. As he approached the vehicle, Barrett ran through his mental checklist. Right hand near his holster, standard procedure, left hand carrying his ticket book. Walk slightly behind the driver's door, maintain a safe distance. The morning sun made it hard to see clearly through the car's windows, but he could make out a single occupant, a woman in casual clothes. "Good morning," he called out in his best professional voice, the one he practiced countless times in the academy. "I'm Officer Barrett with the City Police Department. The reason I stopped you today was an illegal turn back there at Cedar Street." The words came out automatically, just like in training. The driver's response, however, wasn't what he expected. She seemed perfectly calm, almost too calm, as if this were a minor interruption in her day rather than a traffic stop. Something about her confidence made Barrett slightly uneasy, not because she was threatening, but because it didn't fit the usual pattern of nervous or apologetic drivers he typically encountered. "License and registration, please," he continued, maintaining his professional tone. The next few moments would set off a chain of events that neither he nor the driver could have anticipated. What should have been a routine traffic stop was about to become something that would make headlines, challenge assumptions, and force an entire city to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and perception. The morning breeze carried the scent of Mrs. Wilson's flowers across the scene, a strangely peaceful backdrop for what was about to unfold. Officer Barrett couldn't know it yet, but this ordinary traffic stop would become a defining moment not just in his career, but in the city's history. And it all hinged on what would happen in the next few minutes between a rookie officer and a driver who was far more than she appeared to be. Regina reached for her purse, her hand freezing mid-motion as realization struck. She'd switched bags this morning and left her wallet in her other purse. A simple mistake that anyone could make, but as she looked up at the officer's expectant face, she knew this wouldn't be a simple situation to explain. "Officer," she began, keeping her voice steady and professional, "I apologize, but I seem to have left my wallet in my other purse at home. I'm actually Mayor Regina Washington." She watched his expression, seeing the flicker of doubt cross his young face. She'd seen that look before, the one that said, "You don't look like what I expected." Officer Barrett shifted his weight, his hand resting a bit more firmly on his belt. "Ma'am, I need to see some form of identification." His voice had taken on a more authoritative tone, the kind that made Regina's heart sink. She'd been here before, not as a mayor, but as a black woman trying to be heard. "I understand completely," she said, maintaining her composure. "If you'd allow me to make a quick call to my office, my staff can verify my identity immediately." She reached slowly for her phone, making sure her movements were deliberate and visible. Years of experience had taught her the importance of being careful in moments like these. A small crowd was starting to gather on the sidewalk. Mrs. Thompson from the bakery had stopped sweeping her storefront. Two joggers had slowed to a walk, then stopped completely. And there it was, the first phone coming out to record. Regina could feel the situation sliding sideways like a car on black ice. "Please step out of the vehicle," Officer Barrett commanded, his rookie nervousness now masked by an extra layer of authority. The growing audience seemed to make him more rigid, more by the book. Regina recognized the fear behind his official demeanor, the fear of losing control of the situation, of making a mistake, of ending up as another viral video. As she carefully opened her door, Regina noticed more phones recording now. The morning sun caught the screen of someone's device, sending a bright flash across her vision. She could hear whispers starting to build like wind through autumn leaves. "That's the mayor," someone said. "Is he really arresting her?" asked another voice. "Officer," Regina tried one more time, standing straight but non-threatening. "I'm sure we can resolve this professionally. I have a meeting at the community garden in 20 minutes. The entire city council will be there. They can all verify who I am." She gestured toward her phone again. Just one quick call. But something had shifted in Officer Barrett's demeanor. Maybe it was the growing crowd, maybe it was the pressure of all those recording phones, or maybe it was just the uncertainty of how to handle a situation that had spiraled beyond a simple traffic stop. His training hadn't covered this scenario: what to do when someone claims to be the mayor but can't prove it. The crowd had grown larger now. A delivery truck driver had stopped, leaving his vehicle idling. The morning chorus of birdsongs was replaced by the murmur of concerned citizens and the distinct sound of social media notifications pinging as videos began to spread. Regina could feel the tension building like a thunderstorm about to break. She thought about all the community meetings she'd led about police community relations, all the promises she'd made about building bridges and understanding. Now here she was, living what so many of her constituents had described at those very meetings. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she knew her next actions would be crucial, not just for her, but for her city. The situation balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, one misunderstanding could turn this into exactly the kind of incident she'd worked so hard to prevent in her city. As Mayor Washington stood there, watched by phones and worried faces, she had to decide: assert her authority and risk escalation, or comply and trust that the truth would prevail. The words "you're under arrest" hung in the air like heavy storm clouds. Regina felt her breath catch as Officer Barrett reached for his handcuffs. She handled budget crises, natural disasters, and heated town halls, but this was different. This was personal in a way that made her chest tight and her thoughts race. "Please turn around and put your hands behind your back," Officer Barrett instructed, his voice carrying the slight tremor of someone trying very hard to sound confident. The growing crowd gasped collectively, and the clicking of phone cameras intensified. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's our mayor!" But the officer seemed to have crossed a point of no return. Regina made a split-second decision. Years of public service had taught her that sometimes leadership meant swallowing your pride for the greater good. "I'll comply, officer," she said clearly, making sure her voice carried to all the recording phones. "But I want everyone watching to stay calm. We'll sort this out properly." As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Regina noticed little details that her mind seemed determined to photograph. The coffee cup still sitting in her car's holder, steam no longer rising from it. A child on a bicycle stopped at the corner, mouth open in surprise. The morning newspaper lying unread on her passenger seat, its headlines now seeming trivially unimportant. Officer Barrett began reciting her rights, his words coming out in a rehearsed rhythm that didn't quite mask his growing uncertainty. The crowd had swelled to nearly 30 people now, their murmurs growing louder, more insistent. Some were on their phones, not just recording but calling the media, calling the city hall, calling anyone who might be able to stop what they were watching. "My staff is expecting me at the community garden," Regina said calmly as she was led to the patrol car. "When I don't show up, they'll know something's wrong." She caught a glimpse of Mrs. Thompson from the bakery furiously typing on her phone, probably messaging her daughter who worked at City Hall. News would spread fast in their tight-knit community. The back of the patrol car felt surreal, cold leather seats, the mesh barrier between the front and back, that distinctive new car smell mixed with cleaning products. Regina had been in police cars before, but always in the front seat, always as the mayor reviewing the department's new vehicles or accompanying officers on community outreach programs. The irony wasn't lost on her. From her new vantage point, she could see Officer Barrett talking into his radio, his free hand running through his hair in what looked like growing stress. The crowd had started chanting now, not aggressively, but persistently. "That's our mayor! That's our mayor!" Some held their phones high above their heads, streaming the scene live to social media. Through the car window, Regina spotted Mr. Chen, who owned the local hardware store, arguing with someone who seemed ready to escalate the situation. She caught his eye and shook her head slightly, a silent plea for calm. He nodded, understanding immediately, and began quietly talking to those around him, helping maintain order. Officer Barrett got into the driver's seat, his back rigid with tension. In the rearview mirror, Regina could see beads of sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He was young, probably not much older than her own son, and she could tell he was starting to realize that this routine traffic stop had become anything but routine. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Regina watched her city through the window, the familiar streets now looking different from this new perspective. She thought about all the community meetings where citizens had shared similar stories, all the times she'd promised to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Now she was living that gap, experiencing firsthand what so many had tried to tell her. The car turned onto Main Street, and Regina could see the first news van already setting up, their antenna reaching toward the sky like a metal tree. This story was about to explode, and she knew that how she handled the next few hours would define not just her legacy as mayor, but potentially the future of police-community relations in her city. The news spread through the city like wildfire in a dry forest. Lisa Chen, the mayor's assistant, was setting up chairs at the community garden when her phone started buzzing nonstop. First came a text from Mrs. Thompson at the bakery, then a frantic call from a council member, followed by an explosion of social media notifications. The mayor's been what? Lisa nearly dropped her phone, the metal chairs forgotten. Her hands trembled as she opened a live video stream. There it was, their mayor being led away in handcuffs. The same mayor who was supposed to be planting tomatoes with community volunteers in 15 minutes. Inside City Hall, the normal Tuesday morning quiet erupted into chaos. Phones rang off the hook, email notifications pinged like a digital symphony gone wrong, and staff members rushed between offices, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. The press room, usually empty at this hour, began filling with reporters who seemed to materialize out of thin air. "Have you seen this?" A secretary burst into the weekly department head meeting, holding up her phone. The video was already hitting national news networks. The police chief's face drained of color as he watched the footage, immediately recognizing both the mayor and the young officer he personally welcomed to the force 6 months ago. Outside on the streets, the scene had transformed. What started as a small gathering of concerned citizens had grown into a substantial crowd. People left their shops, offices, and homes, drawn by the magnetic pull of breaking news. Some carried hastily made signs, others just stood in groups, sharing videos and discussing what they'd seen. The community garden sat empty, chairs arranged in neat rows facing a podium that would now stand unused. The volunteers, who'd arrived early with their gardening tools and excitement, instead huddled around phones and tablets, watching events unfold. The morning's planned celebration had transformed into an impromptu gathering of worried citizens. Back at the bakery where it all started, Mrs. Thompson's shop had become an unofficial news headquarters. People packed inside, buying coffee and pastries, while watching the coverage on the small TV she'd installed last year. "I saw the whole thing," she kept telling anyone who would listen, her morning's baking forgotten in the oven, filling the shop with the smell of slightly overdone cinnamon rolls. Social media exploded with hashtags and shares. Local community groups lit up with discussions, theories, and calls for action. The video of the arrest had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times, with numbers climbing by the minute. National news organizations began picking up the story, their headlines growing more dramatic with each passing moment. At the local high school, teachers struggled to keep students focused as phones buzzed with updates. Many of these students had worked with the mayor on youth initiatives. They'd seen her at basketball games, school assemblies, and community events. Now they watched in disbelief as their mayor's arrest played out on their phone screens. The city's public information officer, usually calm under pressure, paced in his office while trying to craft a statement. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Calls from newspapers, TV stations, radio shows, and even international media outlets. How do you explain something you're still trying to understand yourself? Lisa Chen finally managed to reach the mayor's husband, Robert, who was in the middle of a business meeting. "Turn on the news," was all she could say. She heard him gasp, then the sound of a chair scraping back, followed by hurried footsteps. Another life turned upside down in the span of a morning. The police station, normally quiet on a Tuesday morning, transformed into the eye of a media storm. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees searching for signals. Reporters stood in front of their cameras, gesturing toward the building where both the mayor and the young officer who arrested her were about to face a moment that would define their lives and their city's future. Through it all, social media continued its relentless pace. Every minute brought new angles, new opinions, new calls for action or patience. The story was no longer just about a mayor and an officer. It had become a mirror reflecting deeper truths about their community, their assumptions, and the long road ahead. The police station's front desk sergeant was in the middle of his third coffee when the patrol car pulled into the station's parking lot. He glanced up at the security monitor, expecting to see another routine arrest. Instead, he choked on his coffee, sending brown drops flying across his morning paperwork. "Sweet mother of," he muttered, recognizing the woman in handcuffs being led through the back entrance. He'd voted for her twice, had shaken her hand at last year's police appreciation dinner, and now she was walking into his station in custody. The sergeant grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the chief's number. Officer Barrett tried to maintain his professional demeanor, but his face had gone pale, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead. The walk from the car to the booking area felt like miles. Every officer they passed did a double take, some freezing mid-step, others quickly ducking into doorways to make urgent phone calls. "I believe there's been a mistake," the desk sergeant said, standing up so quickly his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "Officer Barrett, this is Mayor Washington." His voice carried a mix of respect and barely controlled panic. The young officer's face went from pale to almost green. Regina stood quietly, her hands still cuffed behind her back, watching the realization dawn on Officer Barrett's face. She saw the moment it hit him, the moment he understood exactly who he had arrested. His hands started shaking as he reached for his handcuff keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the cuffs. The station erupted into controlled chaos. The police chief burst through the door, slightly out of breath from running down 3 flights of stairs. Behind him, the deputy chief and several senior officers piled into the small booking area. They looked like they'd seen a ghost, or maybe their careers flashed before their eyes. "Mayor Washington," the chief started, his voice catching slightly. "I cannot begin to express." But Regina held up her hand, stopping his apology mid-sentence. Her wrists showed slight marks from the handcuffs, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. Officer Barrett stood frozen, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. The rookie cop who'd started his shift thinking about traffic violations now found himself at the center of what would surely become a national story. His dream of a quiet Tuesday had turned into a career-defining nightmare. "Could someone please call my husband?" Regina asked, her voice steady and dignified. "And I'll need my phone back." She turned to Officer Barrett, who seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible. "Officer, I think we both have something to learn from this morning." The room fell silent, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see how their mayor would handle this situation. They'd seen other incidents like this end with fired officers, lawsuits, and divided communities. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Through the windows, they could hear the growing crowd outside. News trucks had already lined up like carnival attractions, their satellite dishes pointing skyward. Reporters crowded the steps, and social media was exploding with different versions of the story, some accurate, others wildly exaggerated. The chief's secretary appeared with Regina's personal items, handling her phone and keys like they were precious artifacts. Behind her, the station's public information officer was already sweating through his shirt, knowing he'd have to face the media circus gathering outside. Regina checked her phone. 47 missed calls, over 200 text messages, and social media notifications that seemed to multiply like rabbits. But her eyes fixed on one message from her husband. "I'm on my way. Stay strong. Love you." Those simple words almost broke her composed demeanor. Officer Barrett finally found his voice. "Ma'am, Mayor Washington." He stammered, but words failed him. His whole body seemed to be apologizing, his shoulders slumped, his eyes unable to meet hers. The weight of his actions was visibly crushing him. The mayor looked around the room, at all these faces she knew from community meetings and city functions, now gathered in this unexpected moment of crisis. She took a deep breath, straightened her sweater, and prepared to address not just the people in this room, but the whole city waiting outside. How she handled the next few minutes would either heal or divide her community. The evening sun cast long shadows across the steps of City Hall as Regina Washington stepped up to the podium. The crowd that had gathered was larger than any town hall meeting she'd ever held. Hundreds of faces turned toward her, some angry, some concerned, all waiting to hear how their mayor would respond to the morning's events. Camera lights flashed like lightning bugs on a summer evening. News reporters held their microphones forward, and phones recorded from every angle. The air felt electric with anticipation. Behind her stood the police chief, looking solemn, and her husband Robert, his hand resting supportively on her shoulder. "My fellow citizens," Regina began, her voice clear and steady. "Today, our city experienced something that has sparked intense emotions and heated discussions. Many of you watched as I was arrested this morning during a routine traffic stop." She paused, letting the reality of those words sink in. The crowd murmured, and someone shouted, "Fire that officer!" Regina held up her hand, and the crowd fell silent. Years of teaching high school before entering politics had taught her how to command attention without raising her voice. "I see the anger in your faces. I understand it. I felt it too," she continued, adjusting the microphone slightly. "But right now, our city doesn't need more anger. What happened this morning wasn't just about me or about Officer Barrett. It was about something deeper in our community that needs healing." In the front row, Mrs. Thompson from the bakery dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Next to her, Mr. Chen from the hardware store nodded slowly, his earlier anger seeming to soften. The crowd listened intently as their mayor shared her experience not with rage, but with wisdom. "I could demand Officer Barrett's badge," Regina said, her words carrying across the hushed gathering. "I could file lawsuits. I could feed the anger I see in your faces." She shook her head slowly. "But that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I want to use this moment to make real changes." Officer Barrett stood at the back of the crowd, still in uniform despite suggestions that he take the day off. His face showed the strain of the day, but he stood straight, accepting the occasional glares from those around him. Regina caught his eye and gave a small nod, surprising many in the crowd. "Starting tomorrow," she announced, "we're launching new initiatives for police community relations. Not just meetings and speeches, but real programs. Our officers will spend time in our communities not just as law enforcement, but as neighbors and friends. And yes, Officer Barrett has agreed to be part of this program." The crowd stirred, surprised. Some faces showed confusion, others showed cautious hope. A child sitting on her father's shoulders waved a small hand-drawn sign that read, "We love our mayor." Regina smiled, remembering why she'd run for office in the first place, to make a difference. "I'm not saying it will be easy," she continued, her voice carrying emotion now. "Change never is. But I believe in this city. I believe in our police department's ability to learn and grow. And most importantly, I believe in our community's ability to come together, even in difficult times like these." As she spoke, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd. Someone started clapping, then another, and soon the applause spread like waves on a pond. Even some of the more angry faces began to soften, touched by their mayor's choice to build bridges rather than walls. "Let's turn this moment of division into an opportunity for unity," Regina concluded, her voice strong with conviction. "Let's show other cities that when faced with challenges, we choose understanding over anger, growth over blame, and hope over fear." The applause grew louder, drowning out the last echoes of the day's tension. In that moment, watching her citizens come together, Regina felt the weight of the morning's handcuffs fade away, replaced by the stronger bonds of community and purpose. As the crowd began to disperse, many lingered to shake hands, share words of support, or simply be part of this moment. The news cameras kept rolling, capturing not the explosive confrontation they'd expected, but something far more powerful, a community choosing to grow stronger through understanding rather than falling apart in anger. 2 weeks after the incident, the police training room buzzed with nervous energy. Officers filled every seat, some standing along the walls, all eyes fixed on the podium where Mayor Washington stood beside Officer Barrett. The young officer's uniform was perfectly pressed, but his hands fidgeted slightly as he faced his colleagues. "I made a mistake. Officer Barrett began, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. But Mayor Washington showed me that mistakes can become opportunities if we're brave enough to learn from them. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Some of the veteran officers nodded, understanding the courage it took to stand there. Regina stepped forward, her presence bringing a calm to the room. When Officer Barrett pulled me over that morning, we were both playing roles we'd been given by society. But today, we're choosing new roles, as teachers and students, learning from each other. The training session wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of lectures about policies and procedures, they shared stories. Community members filled the room with their experiences, and officers opened up about their fears and challenges. Mrs. Thompson brought her famous cinnamon rolls, turning a formal training into something more like a family gathering. "Remember when you used to visit my bakery every morning?" Mrs. Thompson asked Officer Barrett during a break, offering him a warm roll. "You stopped coming after. Well, we've missed you." The simple gesture brought tears to the young officer's eyes, and several other officers discreetly wiped their eyes too. The new training program spread beyond the classroom. Officers began spending their coffee breaks in local shops, joining community sports games, and attending neighborhood events. The sight of police cars parked outside the community center became normal, not cause for concern. One afternoon, Regina watched from her office window as Officer Barrett helped a group of kids plant flowers in the community garden, the same garden she never made it to that fateful morning. The children's laughter mixed with his patient instructions about proper planting depth made her smile. The police chief's weekly reports showed promising changes. Complaints were down, while positive community interactions had increased significantly. Officers reported feeling more connected to the neighborhoods they patrolled, and citizens were more likely to approach them with information or concerns. Local businesses joined the initiative. Mr. Chen's hardware store offered discounts to officers working on community projects. The coffee shop created a community corner where officers and residents could sit together, sharing conversations over steaming cups. These small changes began weaving a new pattern of trust through the city. The media noticed too. News crews that had come expecting to cover protests and division instead found themselves documenting something different, a city actively working to heal its wounds. National papers wrote about the Washington model, and other cities began sending representatives to learn from their experience. Regina received invitations to speak at conferences and police academies across the country. But she always started her speeches the same way. "This isn't about me or one incident. It's about a community that chose to build bridges instead of walls." Officer Barrett found his own voice in the process. He began speaking to new recruits about his experience, his honesty touching even the most cynical listeners. "I thought I knew what police work was about," he would tell them. "But I learned more about being a good officer in the weeks after my mistake than I did in all my academy training." The changes weren't always easy. Some officers resisted the new approaches, and some community members remained skeptical. But Regina and Officer Barrett kept showing up, kept listening, kept working to bring people together. Their partnership became a powerful symbol of what could happen when people chose understanding over anger. One evening, as another successful training session ended, an elderly resident approached Officer Barrett. And she said, patting his arm, "Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who learned their lessons the hard way." The officer smiled, watching as officers and community members mingled, sharing stories and snacks, no longer separated by invisible barriers of fear and mistrust. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning. The community garden, once the unvisited destination of that dramatic day, now bloomed with fall flowers and late-season vegetables. Mayor Washington stood among the plants, remembering how a simple traffic stop had transformed their city. A familiar police cruiser pulled up, and Officer Barrett stepped out, carrying a tray of coffee from Mrs. Thompson's bakery. He'd made it his morning ritual now, not out of guilt, but genuine connection. The young officer who once trembled at his mistake had grown into a respected leader in community policing. "The new cadets are arriving today," he said, handing Regina her coffee. He remembered how she liked it, just a touch of cream. "They're excited about the community integration program. Word's gotten around that we do things differently here." Children played nearby, their backpacks scattered on benches as they stopped on their way to school. None of them flinched when police cars drove past anymore. Instead, they waved, knowing most officers by name. Some even wore plastic badges, proudly declaring they wanted to be community officers when they grew up. The local news crew set up their equipment for a special report. 6 months ago, they'd rushed here hoping to catch conflict and controversy. Now, they were filming a different story, one of transformation. The reporter, who'd covered the arrest that day, smiled as she watched Officer Barrett help a small girl water the tomato plants. "Remember when this garden was empty?" Regina asked, gesturing at the thriving space around them. Raised beds overflowed with vegetables, and painted benches invited people to sit and chat. The garden had become more than just a green space, it was a symbol of their city's growth. The morning's community meeting brought together faces that would have been unlikely companions half a year ago. The police chief sat next to Mr. Chen, discussing plans for a youth mentorship program. Mrs. Thompson shared her famous cinnamon rolls while chatting with new officers about their families. Regina watched as Officer Barrett led a session on community engagement. His voice carried confidence now, but also humility. "Every interaction is an opportunity," he told the group. "Every moment can either build trust or break it. We choose which it will be." The city's statistics told their own story. Complaints against officers had dropped by 60%. Community tip lines received more calls, helping solve crimes faster. But the real changes showed in smaller ways. Officers being invited to family barbecues, kids running to patrol cars to share their good grades, elderly residents feeling safe enough to take evening walks again. Other cities sent representatives to learn from their example. Regina and Officer Barrett often spoke together at these sessions, their unlikely partnership a powerful testimony to what could happen when people chose understanding over division. The garden's notice board displayed photos of their journey, the tense day of the arrest, the community meetings that followed, and the gradual transformation. Below these hung pictures of police officers coaching youth sports teams, attending block parties, and helping at local schools. Each image told a story of bridges built and trust earned. As the morning's meeting wound down, a new family in the neighborhood approached Officer Barrett. Their young son, shy at first, showed him a drawing of a police car next to a garden. "Is this where you help grow things?" the boy asked. Barrett knelt down, explaining how the whole community helped the garden grow, just like they helped the community grow stronger. Regina checked her phone. A message from the National Police Academy asked her and Officer Barrett to speak at their graduation ceremony. She smiled, remembering how close they'd come to being a cautionary tale. Instead, they'd become an example of how crisis could lead to transformation. The autumn breeze carried the scent of ripening tomatoes and Mrs. Thompson's fresh bread from across the street. Regina watched as officers and residents lingered after the meeting, sharing stories and making plans for upcoming community events. This, she realized, was what real change looked like, not in grand gestures or speeches, but in small moments of connection, trust, and shared purpose. "We still have work to do," Officer Barrett said, joining her as the crowd dispersed. Regina nodded, but her smile remained. They did have more work to do, but now they had something essential, a community ready to do that work together.